Hello and welcome to the latest video in my Theories of IR series. So in this video we're going to start to take a look at neo-Marxist approaches to international relations, and specifically we're going to be looking at a couple of approaches called dependency theory and world systems theory. But before we actually move on to that, I wanted to say a little bit first of all about classical Marxism, because dependency and world systems theory basically are rooted in what we might call the Marxist tradition. Now, classical Marxism itself is not actually a theory of IR per se. It's a theory of history, it's a theory of economics, it's a theory of society, it's a theory of social organisation. It's not really a theory of international relations as such. However, some of the core concepts that are drawn upon in dependency and world systems theory and certain other approaches as well, some of those core concepts are derived from classical Marxism. So just in case you haven't studied Marxism at all before, if you have, then perhaps you might feel confident to skip this kind of first bit of the video. But particularly if in case you haven't studied Marxism at all before, it's worthwhile kind of going over a few of these core concepts which are relevant for our purposes. So, classical Marxism, obviously originated with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 19th century. And Marx's theory of history was based on a few kind of core assumptions, one of which is the idea that society evolves over time. And in particular, Marx argued that every human society is based around production. The fundamental human activity is production. What do we mean by production? Well, we mean by means of work, by means of labour, the creation of the things that humans need to, first of all, survive, and secondly, to have a decent sort of quality of life. So if we go right back to the Stone Age, production would have meant hunting, it would have meant gathering, it would have meant creating the tools, so for example stone tools or wooden spears for example, which were used in production. As history progressed and societies became more advanced, then production shifted to agricultural production and the creation of things like pottery and metalwork and so on, ultimately culminating in the Industrial Revolution, so that in Marx's time and later, production was now kind of industrialised, mechanised, took place in factories and so on. But nonetheless, production being the fundamental human activity, the idea is that every human society is based around production and the need to produce. And the social relations around production, so basically society, the way that society works is geared around production, and all social relations within a society ultimately are geared around production. So a couple of further key terms, the idea of the means of production. The means of production is essentially all of the things that are required to produce, all of the things that are required for production. So again, in the Stone Age, the means of production would have been the land itself and the animals which lived on it, and the plants which were harvested. And also, again, things like the tools needed to do that, so the weapons used in hunting and in butchering an animal, for example, or the tools used to harvest plants and so on, those constituted the means of production. In the modern day, the means of production would include things like the factories, still the land, the factories, the machinery, the tools, and so on. The things that are required to produce. Those are the means of production. What we call the mode of production refers again to social relations and how those are organised in a particular society. So let me explain a little bit more what we mean about the mode of production and the kind of progression of history through different phases. So Marx believed that human society essentially evolved and was still evolving over time, and that history unfolded and unfolds in a series of distinct phases. So the first phase of history Marx called primitive communism, and essentially this is the Stone Age. This is the period when human beings are living in small bands and essentially living off the land, hunting and gathering. Marx called this primitive communism because he believed that in this period there were really no economic divisions in society. Again, that's not to say that there wouldn't have been any social distinctions at all. I think it's likely that, within a band there may have been some kind of hierarchy. Possibly someone would have been in charge. Perhaps the strongest individual, or perhaps the person who was the smartest individual. Perhaps the oldest individuals who had the most experience might have been in charge. We can speculate about that. There might have been some hierarchy. In terms of wealth, there wouldn't have been any real disparity because those societies really didn't have much in the way of wealth. They didn't have the ability to accumulate wealth. Basically, in a hunter-gatherer society, you kind of go out and you gather the things that you need and you consume them immediately. So you go out, you hunt for food, you create the tools that you need to do that. You gather plant-based foods and so on, but there's no kind of capacity to store wealth. So essentially there are no rich and poor. Everyone is at pretty much the same economic level. So that's what Marx meant by primitive communism, a society which was at the hunter-gatherer phase and really had no economic divisions, no class divisions. Then we get into the development of early civilization. So, of course, that originated at different times in different parts of the world. So we had the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. We had the development of agriculture, perhaps about 8 to 10,000 years ago. So the beginnings of that anyway. Ancient India a little bit later, ancient China a little bit later, in kind of Mesoamerica and so on. Agriculture independently developed there. And agriculture made possible, first of all, it necessitated a different way of life. It kind of required human beings to stay in one place to raise their crops and tend their crops, whereas earlier kind of human bands had kind of wandered around following herds of animals. The invention of agriculture necessitated a more settled way of life, but it also enabled societies with much larger populations, and it enabled for the first time differentiation of labour. So agriculture can feed a lot more people than hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering can only support a small population. Agriculture can support a lot more people. But also, in an agricultural society, not everyone needs to be a farmer. It's possible for just some people to actually take care of farming and growing crops. That frees up other people to do other things. So you have people, taking up kind of professional crafts, if you like. So the first blacksmiths producing metalwork, potters, weavers, basket makers, and so on. You have people specialising in different trades. You possibly also tended to have the first kind of priestly castes, people kind of specialising as priests, and you had the emergence of the first kind of leadership, hereditary leadership castes or classes, if you like. And the societies of antiquity, so from Sumeria, the ancient Egypt, through to kind of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and so on, Marx was really focusing on Europe and the Near East and Middle East in discussing this, but these societies of antiquity in the Middle East and in Europe and North Africa were based around slavery. So the Roman economy, for example, was absolutely dependent on slave labour. Now, yes, it was a little bit more nuanced than that. There were kind of people who were, free labourers as well, but the bulk of labour power came from slavery. So essentially, again, the reality was a little bit more complex, I know, but simplifying things a little bit, essentially you had two classes in antiquity. You had those who did the work, who for the most part were slaves, and you had the ruling elite who essentially lived off the backs of the slaves. So you had workers and you had rulers, and one class basically lived off the backs of the other class. Now, of course, with the collapse of Rome, and which kind of took place over a number of centuries, but in kind of Western Europe, the Roman Empire came to an end in the 5th, 6th kind of century, and was replaced during the Dark Ages, going to the medieval period, was replaced with feudalism. And again, we saw similar systems to feudalism appearing in other parts of the world as well. So again, if you're kind of familiar with the concept of feudalism, feudalism is a means of social organisation which is based on a hierarchy. At the top level you have kind of a major lord who would be a king, for example. The king would lay claim to all of the land within his, or occasionally her, but usually he. Usually it was a male ruler, with a few exceptions. Would lay claim to all of the land within his realm, and the king would then appoint certain senior nobles who would basically swear fealty, swear loyalty to the king, and would in return be rewarded by given a chunk of land to kind of rule in the king's name. So they would be kind of the major lords, the barons. The barons themselves would have their own kind of lesser lords under them, lesser landlords, so people perhaps from the knightly class, who would kind of be lords of the manor kind of level. They would swear loyalty to the baron and swear to do military service if necessary, and in return they would be rewarded with a package of land. They would then have their own what we call vassals, their own underlings below them, all the way down to the level of the peasants. And the peasants, again, were the people who did most of the actual work, produced the crops and so on. And the peasants were, again, the reality is a little bit more complex, but a large number of the peasants were serfs. Serfdom was not quite the same thing as slavery, because serfs had certain rights, whereas slaves, for example, in ancient Rome, slaves had no rights at all. If you were a slave, then you were the property of your owner, and your owner could do whatever they liked with you, including they could arbitrarily have you killed if they wanted to do that, and that was not seen as murder. Basically, the slave was the property of the owner in law, and the owner could do whatever they liked, up to and including killing that person. With a serf, it wasn't quite like that. Serfs did have certain rights, so the landlord, at least in theory, couldn't arbitrarily kill a serf, and that if they did so, that would in law be murder. Also, the serfs only had to fulfil certain obligations, so it might be customary, for example, and it varied from place to place, but in a particular place it might be customary for the serfs to give 100 days a year of service to their landlord. The lord couldn't just come along and say to the serf, right, this year I need you to do 120 days. The serfs will be in their rights to say, no, that's not customary, that's not the deal. The deal is 100 days per year. So the serfs had some rights. They were not slaves, but they were not free either. They couldn't leave the land without permission from the Lord. They couldn't even do things like get married without permission from the Lord. So while they were not out and out slaves, and they did have some rights, they were not free. And essentially we still have this two-class system where the serfs do the work and the wealthy elite live off the back of the serfs, live off the back of those who do the work. Feudalism gave way to industrial capitalism with the Industrial Revolution. So now we no longer have serfdom, and in theory the workers are now free. But in practice, Marx argued they are not free really, because they are dependent upon earning a wage. So as in previous times, we still have the wealthy elite, who are those who control the means of production. So in earlier times, the means of production, again, that meant the land and so on. So the landlords controlled the means of production under feudalism. Under industrialism, you still have this class, which Marx called the bourgeoisie, who control and own the means of production. The means of production now being the factories, the machines, the mines, and so on. And you have this other class who do not control the means of production and therefore have nothing to sell but their labour power. They are the proletariat, and they make up the vast majority of the population. Just as the majority of the population in medieval Europe were serfs, in the industrial period the vast majority of the population are the proletariat, and they do the work, and the wealthy elite, the bourgeoisie, essentially live off the backs of the proletariat. So once again you have these two classes, those who work and those who live off the backs of those who work. Marx believed that this system would inevitably come to an end and would be replaced by industrial communism. I'll come back onto that in a few moments' time. So Marx believed that history was progressive. It's a common misconception that Marx was saying that that capitalism is the worst system ever. Capitalism is totally evil and the worst system ever. That's not what Marx was actually saying. Marx was saying that capitalism is bad because it's still exploitative, but it is actually an improvement upon the old feudal system. It's certainly an improvement on slavery. It represents a development in technology, but also development in the organisation of society. And Marx also believed that industrial capitalism was necessary, that before you could get to industrial communism, you had to first of all go through a phase of industrial capitalism. So Marx saw capitalism, if you like, as a necessary evil, as a phase in history which had to come, but which also, in its turn, would inevitably give way to the next phase of history, to industrial communism. So this is why we call Marxism a deterministic theory of history. Marx is not saying, yeah, it would be nice if we had communism, it would be nice if capitalism were to be overthrown and replaced by a communist system. That's not what Marx is saying. Marx is saying that it is absolutely inevitable that that capitalism will be overthrown and will be superseded with a communist system. It's just a matter of time. Just as it was inevitable that slavery would be replaced by feudalism, and feudalism would be replaced by industrial capitalism, so the next stage is inevitable as well. So a deterministic theory of history. So again, we've mentioned the idea of class. So again, to Marx, in each period of history, there are two social classes. There are those who control the means of production, which in an industrial society meant the bourgeoisie, and there are those who labour, which in an industrial society are the proletariat. Now that brings us on to talking about why, a little bit more detail about why Marx saw industrial capitalism as an inherently exploitative system. And that leads us on to talking about the concept of surplus value. So, in explaining the concept of surplus value, if we kind of consider a factory, for example, And we've got a factory owner, who obviously is a member of the bourgeoisie, and we have lots of factory workers. But let's just concentrate on one worker in particular to illustrate the point. So according to Marxists, all value is created through labour power. Ultimately, the value of anything is the labour power that goes into producing it. So each worker in the factory each day is producing whatever the factory produces. Let's say it's kind of, I don't know, steam engines, for example, to take a Victorian example. So the worker each day produces a certain amount of value through his or her work. So this square here represents the amount of wealth created by that worker in one particular day. Now, obviously, the wealth created, some of that is going to go towards paying the worker a wage. You have to pay your workers a wage. First of all, you need them to survive so that they can come back and work for you the next day and remain reasonably healthy. And they're not going to keep coming back and working for you if you don't pay them something. So you have to pay them a wage. But as the factory owner, you are obviously not going to give them the full value of what they've created, because if you did, there will be no profit in it for you. So you'll give them the minimum, really, that you can get away with. So that kind of little blue section at the bottom, that represents the fraction of the wealth created that actually goes back to the worker as wages. And the rest is what we call the surplus value. What happens to the surplus value? Well, of course, it goes to the factory owner in the form of profit. And this is why, to a Marxist, this system is inherently exploitative, because the worker, the labourer, is only ever going to be paid a fraction of the value of the wealth that they've created, and the factory owner is essentially going to get richer based on extracting the surplus value, the rest of the value of what the worker has created. So the result of that is kind of a net drain of wealth from the workers to the bourgeoisie. The factory owner will get richer and richer in theory, but the factory worker can never get richer. Why? Because most of the wealth that he creates is continually being drained away from him. It's continually being taken away by the factory owner, so he can never get richer. He's stuck at that kind of level, and down the generations, probably his children will be stuck at that level as well. We know in practice it doesn't always work like that people can sometimes start at the bottom and work their way up the ladder. But again, this is a bit of a simplification of reality. But this is kind of the general principle, that the bourgeoisie tend to stay rich and get richer. The proletariat tend to stay where they are because they can, they can never really catch a break, if you like. The money that they earn is continually being taken away from them. However, Marx also believed that in the long term this situation was unstable, that there would be increasing polarisation in society, so the rich would get richer and richer and richer, and the poor would essentially stay the same or possibly get poorer, due to competition, cutting wages down to the bone and so on. So increasing polarisation between the rich and the poor, and the number of bourgeoisie would shrink also, because, again, cutthroat nature of capitalism, big firms taking over smaller firms, and ultimately the kind of small companies would go out of business. Ultimately, they wouldn't be able to compete with the bigger ones, and the people who own those firms would therefore have to join the ranks of the proletariat. So a smaller and smaller number of increasingly vastly wealthy people ruling over an increasingly impoverished working class, an increasingly impoverished proletariat, because the wealth is continually being drained upwards. And also capitalism by its nature, and without going into details of why this is the case, but capitalism by its nature having a tendency to be cyclic, i.e. to create patterns of boom and bust, and in the slumps, the industrial slumps in particular, the misery of the workers would be ever more desperate. And eventually Marx believed that things would reach breaking point, that the proletariat would become aware, they would become class conscious, if you like, they would become aware of the fact of their own of their exploitation, the fact that they were being exploited, and they would have a moment of, hang on a minute, we don't need these guys, we do all the work, we actually don't need the bourgeoisie, there are a lot more of us than there are of them, we can actually overthrow this system and take over collective ownership of the means of production and share the wealth equitably among us. So capitalism creating the conditions for its own destruction, and revolution being, according to Marx, inevitable. Marx did kind of believe that perhaps in some cases, in some countries, that the change towards communism might come through democratic constitutional means, but in most cases it was going to mean violent revolution. But either way, the capitalist system, according to Marx, is doomed and is going to be swept away. Just like the feudal system before it, and inevitably be replaced by a communist system where the ownership of the means of production will be shared, will be collectively owned. But of course the truth is that hasn't happened. So again, Marx didn't really say much about what a communist society would look like. There was, kind of an assumption again that there would be shared ownership of the means of production, that ultimately the state itself would wither away because there would be no more need for a state in this kind of utopian society, I guess. Alienation would end and exploitation would end. But of course, it hasn't happened. I mean, Marx died well over a century ago. Those predictions have not come true. And at least in the developed world, the industrialised world, not so much maybe in the poorer regions of the world, but certainly in the developed world, the poor haven't got poorer. Although relative poverty is still very much an issue, working class people for the most part, in a country like the UK, are not living in the same degree of poverty as their Victorian ancestors were. We have things like a National Health Service, creaking though it is, but at least it exists. We have things like a welfare state. We have, a standard of living which maybe isn't great for the people at the bottom of society, but it's still not as bad as the Victorian workhouse. So overall, conditions for the working class, at least in the wealthy countries, have improved, not got worse, contrary to Marx's predictions. So how do Marxists explain this? Well, even as far back as the early 20th century, Marxists were already starting to realise that actually the condition of the workers was not, deteriorating, it was to some extent improving. In countries like the UK and Germany, for example, you saw the beginnings of the welfare state, the first things like unemployment benefits, old age pensions and so on, not to the same degree as today, but the beginnings of the welfare state. Vladimir Lenin, for one, had an explanation for how this worked. So we tend to think of Vladimir Lenin as a political figure, as a revolutionary, and of course as the first leader of the Soviet Union, which of course he was. But he was also very much a scholar as well. He was very much a Marxist philosopher. And Lenin produced a book in 1916 entitled Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And Lenin basically argued that capitalism had survived through colonialism, and that capitalism basically was the driving force behind colonialism. Capitalism expanded outwards. So capitalism essentially expanding outwards from the first industrial countries, expanding outwards into the rest of the world, and essentially finding whole new sources of raw materials, but also labour to exploit. So now the people at the bottom of the ladder, who are being really exploited and suffering the harshest working conditions and the lowest wages and so on, were the workers in the colonies. So essentially, extraction of wealth from the colonies back towards the industrial countries, and particularly to the wealthy elites in the industrial countries, but some of that wealth being used to effectively buy off the workers in the wealthy countries. So now countries like the UK having the kind of surplus money to be able to afford things like implementing the first old age pensions and unemployment insurance and so on. So essentially a new group of people are the people who are being really exploited. That wealth is being drained away from the colonised countries. Some of it, a lot of it, being used to make the rich richer in the wealthy countries, but some of it also being used to kind of buy off the working class in those countries and prevent revolution from happening. Lenin believed that ultimately this was only a temporary situation, that the situation is not going to last, because ultimately, and first of all, imperialism is going to cause the capitalist states to go to war with each other, but also the colonial workers would eventually have the moment of realization, the dawning of class consciousness, and they would be the ones to kind of rise up and overthrow the system. So the collapse of capitalism is still inevitable. It's just been postponed for a while. That was Lenin's argument back in 1916. So that just covers a few kind of basic points from classical Marxism. Now, classical Marxism is in fact much more complicated than this. I have really simplified things here. But these are kind of just a few of the key points that are really important for our purposes as we kind of go on to discuss dependency and world systems theory, which basically draw on. So dependency theory is essentially an updated version of Lenin's imperialism. So again, Lenin talked about imperialism as being the highest stage of capitalism, and he saw the colonial system as essentially being driven by the expansion of capitalism, and the colonies essentially, particularly people in the colonies, being exploited, having wealth drained away from them, and that wealth then flowing towards the colonising countries, and particularly the elites in the colonising countries, but also some of it being used to kind of buy off the working class in the colonising countries as well. But an exploitative system, net drain of wealth from the colonies to the colonising countries. Dependency theory basically is an update of that idea, and essentially says that we are still living in that world, we are still living in that system. Even though colonialism, formal colonialism, has theoretically come to an end, so the formal empires have been dissolved, the former colonies have all of the trappings of independence, they have their flag and their national anthem, and they are legally recognised as sovereign states under their own governments. But dependency essentially says that all of that is a bit of an illusion, that sovereignty is a bit of an illusion, because the former colonised countries remain trapped in this unequal and exploitative economic relationship with the former colonising countries. The former colonising countries being known as the core countries, the former colonies, which is, again, remain exploited, being what dependency theorists call the periphery countries. So the idea of wealth flowing from the periphery of poor countries to the core of wealthy countries. We can visualise it like this, but perhaps it makes more sense to talk about the actual economic relationship between the two. So the periphery are used as a source of raw materials and agricultural products and cheap labour for the core countries, which from those raw materials create manufactured goods and then use the periphery essentially as a dumping ground for their surplus manufactured goods. Now you may think, well, why can't the periphery countries just industrialise and just break out of this relationship? The thing is, it's difficult to do that because the core countries have so much of a head start because of colonialism, because of the kind of enforced extraction of wealth under the colonial system. The core countries were able to industrialise. They have a massive head start on the periphery countries, and it's very difficult for the periphery countries to catch up. So imagine if you are a poor country and you want to create some industry, develop some industry in your own country. How do you go about doing that? So let's say you want to build cars, for example. Let's say you have an economic plan which includes building factories to develop an automotive industry. First of all, where are you going to get the money from, the capital from, to actually develop your industries in the first place? Okay, you can go to Western financial institutions, you can go to the World Bank, you can attempt to get loans from them, and they may well give you the loan, but the terms of that loan are going to be difficult to repay. And so countries which try to borrow money to industrialise end up very often being caught in debt traps. And even if you have the money to invest, it's very difficult to start your automotive industry, for example, from scratch. Why? Because you're competing with the established manufacturers in the wealthy countries. They benefit from economies of scale. They can produce large quantities of automobiles, and because of economies of scale they can do so cheaply. You can't compete with that. As a kind of a country with a fledgling automotive industry, you can't compete with that and produce quality cars at the same price that the industrialised countries can. Now there is maybe a way around that. You could potentially try to go for a protectionist approach, i.e. you can use tariffs to protect your home market. So now imported cars are more expensive compared to your home produced cars, so at least on your home market you have more chance of selling your home produced cars. However, the global system is kind of geared towards discouraging protectionism. It's geared towards free market economics, and whenever poor countries kind of get into trouble, which they often do because of debt traps and so on, if they're kind of forced, for example, to go to the IMF for a bailout, the first thing the IMF is going to do is implement what we call the Washington Consensus, which basically means force a policy package on those countries applying for loans, which basically requires them to open up their markets and get rid of tariffs and participate in the global sort of free market economy. And the global free market economy is just not a level playing field. It favours the established players. So if you're a newcomer to the game, your chances of actually being able to gain some traction and get your industry off the ground are not great. So the chances are you are going to be forced to remain in this position of being a producer of raw materials and primary resources and agricultural products and so on. And again, the core countries are essentially therefore able to enforce their dominance through their established position, through their control of global financial institutions, ultimately through their control of military force as well. Even when investment is made in developing countries, and again, there is a certain amount of foreign investment, being made in developing countries, or so-called developing countries. A dependency theorist wouldn't call them developing, and we'll see why in a moment. But even when investment is made, very often it really doesn't help the poor country all that much, because it takes the form of investment in infrastructure, which essentially helps the core countries, or economic interests in the core countries, to extract the resources from the poor country more efficiently and more quickly. So yeah, we'll build you a railway, we'll build you a port, we'll build you a highway. The purpose of that infrastructure essentially being to help us to extract your resources more efficiently. So the result is a net drain of wealth away from the periphery countries and towards the core countries. And in order to understand this, we can compare it to our model talking about the factory worker and the factory owner. So again, going back to this idea of surplus value, we said that the reason why the factory worker can never get richer is because most of what he or she produces, most of the wealth that he or she creates, is being drained away by the factory owner in the form of surplus value, which is the basis of the factory owner's profits. So because of this extraction of surplus, because most of the wealth that the worker creates has been taken away from them, they can never get richer. And we can apply the same principle to core and periphery countries. So periphery country, like Sudan, for example, is essentially having much of its wealth drained away from it, and towards core countries like the United States. So Sudan can never ultimately get richer because most of its resources are being continually drained away in this kind of neo-colonial relationship of dependency. And this is why dependency theorists won't use the term developing country, because these countries from a dependency perspective can never develop. Because their wealth is continually being drained away from them and towards the core, they have been progressively underdeveloped. They can never develop, just like the workman can never become rich. And at the same time, the wealth taken from the periphery allows an artificially high standard of living in the core, which again, to those of us who live in core countries, that's maybe not a pleasant thought, but there's maybe some truth in it. The reason why we have an NHS and a welfare state and all the things that we enjoy is maybe because someone else is paying for the party. Not a comfortable thought, but I think maybe there is some truth in it. In terms of kind of key writers on dependency theory, people like Hans Singer, Raoul Prebisch, Paul Baron and André Gunder-Frank. Again, most of this stuff was written quite a long time ago, in the middle of the 20th century, so it's not new stuff, but I think nonetheless remains very relevant. So those are some of the key names if you want to kind of do some further reading around dependency theory. So now let's look briefly at world systems theory, which is most closely associated with Immanuel Wallerstein. So world systems theory is essentially an update of dependency theory, which is a little bit more complicated. And it attempts to kind of explain something that dependency theory doesn't explain, which is the fact that sometimes, at least, countries can, in fact, move out of the periphery. They can break out of this dependency relationship and move out of the periphery and industrialise and embark on the path to becoming more wealthy, more advanced economies. So if, for example, we look at the Asian tigers, they would be a good example. A country like South Korea, for example, which 50 or 60 years ago was a poor country, but today is rapidly advancing towards becoming a wealthy, industrialised, advanced economy. Or even some of the Asian tiger economies. So economies like, for example, Vietnam or Thailand, for example. In past decades, these were previously poor countries. Today, increasingly developing towards becoming advanced economies. So it is actually possible for periphery countries to develop sometimes. And Wallerstein attempts to kind of take account of that in world systems theory by adding a new kind of intermediate category of the semi-periphery. And world systems theory acknowledges that countries can sometimes move out of the periphery and pass through this kind of semi-periphery category and ultimately perhaps develop towards being core countries. Also, an acknowledgement that countries in the core can sometimes drop out of the core and be kind of downgraded to semi-periphery countries. Perhaps Russia might be an example of that. So this is the map of the world as Wallerstein saw it. You know, these are kind of the countries that Wallerstein would have kind of listed as periphery. The kind of light-coloured countries would be the periphery, and the sort of medium orange countries would be the semi-periphery, and the dark orange countries would be the core countries. Now, I don't really entirely agree with this map. I think this map is out of date in many respects. So, for example, here we see the countries of Eastern Europe as being listed among the semi-periphery. I don't think that's the case anymore, particularly since most of those countries are now part of the European Union and are increasingly wealthy. So if you look at a country like Poland, for example, Poland is, I think, you know, if not already a core country, then it's certainly moving towards that. A country like Ireland, again, may have been, you know, a relatively poor country in the past, but I think today Ireland is very much a wealthy country. If we look at countries like China, China is a little bit of a strange case in that, on the one hand, you know, on one level, China is this huge industrial economy, the workshop of the world, if you like, and in many respects, China, by some measures anyway, China has the biggest economy in the world, if we look at it in purchasing power parity terms, and in industrial terms kind of dominates the world. But yet we have to remember also that large parts of China remain poor and rural. Large parts of China are still developing. So I would say that parts of China are essentially part of the core, but other parts of China remain part of the periphery. I think we have to take that into account when dealing with the case of China. So anyway, I think overall this map is a little bit out of date, but at least it gives you an idea of, you know, which countries Wallerstein was talking about when he talked about periphery and core and semi-periphery. So again, you know, much like previous dependency theory, the world systems theory basically sees the origins of the current world system as being rooted in the colonialism of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and basically being a perpetuation of that system, although, you know, the system has evolved over time with new states outside of Europe joining the core. But essentially it's still based on an unequal, uneven capitalist system, which relies on the creation of surplus through constantly expanding productivity, which to a Marxist is another way of saying increasing the exploitation of those who create the wealth. So again, as we've already kind of mentioned, wealthy states, and certainly the elites in wealthy states, are able to maintain this system by various means. So again, their control of international financial institutions, their control of bodies like the IMF, like the World Bank, their control of the existing financial system, the existing banking system, and so on. The existence of debt traps, which we've already mentioned, the influence of transnational corporations, and also aspects like control of the media, control of thought, in a sense, control of education, what Gramsci called cultural hegemony. I'm not going to talk about that right now because, again, that's the topic of another video on critical theory, but suffice to say, control of the system of ideas, which basically means that we all grow up with capitalist assumptions from an early age. And therefore we accept capitalism as the only possible system. And ultimately, of course, military strength backing all of this up. Ultimately, the big stick is available. However, both dependency theorists and world systems theorists, being Marxists, do take kind of a deterministic view that the collapse of this system is inevitable. Because, for a start, there will be pushback from the periphery countries. The internal contradictions of capitalism, meaning that capitalism is an unstable system, but also the fact that you cannot have infinite growth with finite resources. Ultimately we have a single planet, and the resources of this planet are finite. And unless we kind of find a way to extract resources from space, which is not really terribly feasible at current levels of technology. I mean, who knows, in 100 years or 200 years or 500 years, who knows what might be possible. But right now, it's not economically viable neither technologically nor economically viable to exploit space commercially in terms of extraction of resources on any kind of scale. So yeah, ultimately we have a single planet with finite resources. You cannot have infinite growth based on finite resources. So eventually capitalism will reach the point where it cannot expand anymore, and then the system will crack. So again, ultimately taking the view that the capitalist global system will ultimately be swept away. Now, how useful is dependency? How useful is world systems theory really? Well, again, certainly there are critiques of both approaches, and one of the key critiques is that these theories are much too simple, that they gloss over the complexities of the global economy, and they overlook the agency of individual countries and the policies pursued by individual countries. And all of that is true, but again, theory is ultimately a simplification of reality. As Kenneth Waltz said about his neo-realist theory, ultimately, if theory were to cover all aspects of reality, to take into account all aspects of reality, then ultimately it would become a description of reality, and as such it would have no analytical power. The point of theory is to simplify reality to enable analysis. So yes, it is a simplification of reality, but I do think that dependency and world systems theory tell us some important things about the nature of the global economy and about economic inequality and global power relations. So what do you think? Once again, if you have any comments or thoughts, please post those in the comments section below. Do you find dependency useful? World systems theory, do you think that this is a good way of looking at the world economy? In particular, does it make more sense to talk about international politics in terms of social and economic forces rather than focusing exclusively on the interactions of states as liberals and realists would do? So again, I'd be interested to read your comments. please post those in the comments section below. Thanks for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video, which will look at a different branch of the neo-Marxist tradition in international relations, namely critical theory. Thanks very much.